After hitting a peak of 9.1% back in June 2022, inflation in the United States had been cooling for nearly 3 years. By January 2026, it was sitting at 2.4%, still slightly above the Federal Reserve's target. By April 2026, inflation had jumped to 3.8%, and in May, it climbed again to 4.2%. The US now has the highest inflation rate in the entire G7, the group of the world's 7 largest wealthy economies. So, what actually happened? Why is inflation rising so quickly, and why is America getting hit harder than almost anywhere else in the developed world? Before we even get to the Iran war or tariffs or gas prices, the United States had already entered the year with an inflation problem of its own. When 2026 began, the United States was running a higher inflation rate than almost every other comparable economy in the world. According to data from the OECD, in January 2026, the G7 area overall had average inflation of 2.1%. France was at just 0.3%. Germany sat right around the G7 average at 2.1%. The United States and the United Kingdom were the only 2 G7 countries with inflation running meaningfully above target. The US came in at 2.4%, while the UK was higher still at above 3%. Every other major economy had already brought prices close to normal. This matters because when an external shock hits, like a sudden spike in oil prices, a country that is already running hot gets hit much harder. So when the energy shock arrived in March 2026, the US had less room to absorb it than Germany, France, Japan, or Canada did. In early March 2026, military conflict broke out involving Iran, and the Strait of Hormuz was effectively closed to shipping. Around 20% of the world's daily oil supply passes through the Strait of Hormuz. When it closed, global oil prices surged. The effects showed up immediately in U.S. energy data. Energy prices in the United States jumped 10.9% in March alone. And by May, the year-over-year energy inflation figure had reached 23.5%. Gasoline specifically costing a lot more than it did a year ago, and that jump at the pump became one of the biggest reasons inflation kept climbing. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, energy costs accounted for more than 60% of the total monthly rise in consumer prices in May 2026. At first glance, it might seem like the United States would benefit from higher oil prices. This is because America is the world's biggest oil producer, so rising oil prices should be good for the country. In fact, the United States is the world's biggest producer of oil. But the U.S. economy is also enormous and highly diversified. The oil and gas industry contributes only about 1.5% to 2% of U.S. GDP, making it a relatively small part of the overall economy. What that means is that when oil prices spike, the gains mostly go to a relatively small group of energy companies. But the pain spreads to everyone else. The International Energy Agency reported that U.S. energy demand actually grew by more than 2% in 2025, the second fastest increase since the year 2000. If we compare U.S. energy inflation with the euro area, the difference is striking. When the energy shock hit in March and April 2026, U.S. energy inflation ran at nearly double the pace of the euro area. The euro area saw energy inflation reach 10.9% in April. The U.S. hit 17.9%. The reason Europe fared better is that it has spent years expanding wind, solar, and nuclear capacity. When oil prices spike, European countries can lean on those alternatives to cushion the blow. The U.S. has far less of that buffer, which made the energy shock hit harder here than anywhere else in the advanced economies. Even before the war started, there was already a tax being added to almost everything Americans buy. That tax is called a tariff, a fee charged on imported goods coming into the country. Over the course of 2025 and early 2026, the U.S. imposed sweeping tariffs across a huge range of imports. According to Stanford's Institute for Economic Policy Research, Goldman Sachs estimates that the current tariff regime raised inflation by roughly 1 percentage point between the second half of 2025 and the first half of 2026. This raises a question: who actually pays for these tariffs? There is a common perception that foreign companies pay for tariffs. But the numbers tell a different story. Research from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York confirmed that roughly 90% of tariff costs were passed on to American businesses and consumers. Goldman Sachs found that by the end of 2025, U.S. consumers were bearing about 55% of the total tariff burden directly. In dollar terms, the Joint Economic Committee estimated that the 2025 tariffs cost the typical U.S. household close to $1,200. The Yale Budget Lab, after accounting for some tariff rollbacks, still put the current annual cost to the average household at between $600 and $800. But the pressure on household budgets does not stop there. Even if you set aside the effects of the war and tariffs on inflation, housing is also pushing prices higher with no sign of easing. On housing, the May 2026 CPI report showed shelter costs rising 3.4% year-over-year. Housing has been one of the most stubborn categories throughout this inflationary period, and it is not hard to see why. Tariffs have raised the cost of building materials. New home construction has slowed. Fewer new homes mean tight supply, which keeps rents and purchase prices elevated across the board. Lastly, to fight the rising inflation, the Federal Reserve is under political pressure. When inflation runs hot, central banks are supposed to raise interest rates or hold them steady to cool things down. The Federal Reserve normally does this independently of politics, but that independence is now under real pressure. President Trump spent years attacking former Fed Chair Jerome Powell for not cutting rates fast enough, and when Powell's term ended in May 2026, Trump replaced him with Kevin Warsh, who has publicly leaned towards supporting lower rates. The problem is that inflation is currently at 4.2% and climbing, and the producer price index hit 6% in April, the highest since December 2022. If the Fed cuts rates now under political pressure instead of holding firm or even hiking, it risks pouring fuel on a fire that is already burning. Let's put everything together. U.S. inflation hit 4.2% in May 2026, a 3-year high and the worst reading in the G7. It got there because several forces hit at once. A hot starting point, an oil shock the U.S. could not absorb as easily as Europe, tariffs quietly raising costs, expensive housing and rising food prices. To fight all of this, the Federal Reserve is now under more political pressure than it has faced in decades. The bigger concern is what comes next. If energy prices remain elevated, tariffs stay in place, and housing costs continue to rise, inflation could prove far more persistent than policymakers expected. That would leave the Federal Reserve facing an uncomfortable choice: keep interest rates high and risk slowing the economy, or cut rates and risk fueling another wave of price increases. Either way, American households are likely to feel the impact through higher living costs, more expensive borrowing, and growing uncertainty about the economic outlook.